is a class on medical anthropology. And my first thing I want to say about medical anthropology is it has been one of the hotter areas of anthropology recently. Even before the coronavirus hit, medical anthropology, people get really into it these days. My Professor Connie Anderson teaches a medical anthropology class here from semester to semester, always full. My wife teaches medical anthropology over at SUNY Oneonta, fills right up. So people have been excited about medical anthropology. Even in your textbook, this is actually the 5th edition, 5 editions of this textbook. I've been teaching it since the 1st edition. And in the 1st edition, they didn't even have a medical anthropology chapter. And then they got one in there. And then, well, they used to end with this. I think I kind of missed the old ending, which was about globalization and the future of the world and the future of anthropology and freedom and stuff. But then they started ending with the medical anthropology chapter. And then in this version, they made it an applied anthropology chapter, but it was mostly medical anthropology. They threw in development, which I guess I wasn't that excited about their development anthropology. It seemed a little bit old-fashioned to me. I think they would have been a lot better off doing a section on the environment and climate issues and how anthropologists have been involved in those, which we have been. And so the issue of development, it's not that it's not important, it's just was a little bit odd. So I decided to stick with the medical anthropology thing because, well, it's something that is on our minds these days. Here we are, all masked up and shooting ourselves with shots and all kinds of things. So it's just something that is on our minds. And so what I want to do in this class is go through why medical anthropology has been so hot, not just now, but even before. What do we get out of it, or what's happening there? So the first reason I think that medical anthropology has been sort of exciting these days is just that people are interested in understanding other people's views about illness, folk medicine, what it means to be healthy. And as some of you noted in the comments, some of the witchcraft stuff comes back in. You may remember the Evans-Pritchard film, Strange Beliefs, and this is going back to the Azande and their ideas about witchcraft and how people get sick and especially die. And so, you know, I mean, I think in the old days, people were very dismissive of these beliefs, and perhaps people still are. But I think we've come to be more interested in how people think about themselves and if their bodies. And my feeling is that even if a lot of things that we choose to believe may not be technically true, but health is a funny thing, because even those things that might not be true, if you believe in them and you act upon them and you start doing things to your body because of them, then it sort of becomes true. It kind of affects your health. And we could say this about other things in anthropology as well. When we talk about the idea of race, for example, even if it is technically not true that people divide neatly up into biological races, if we think they do and we act as if they do, then it kind of starts to have real consequences in the world. So these social ideas can affect our biological health. The other thing I would like to say about witchcraft, which one of you said in the comments, is that a lot of times what these other beliefs do is not that people don't know that there are things like viruses or bacteria, or that people might fall and that's why they're hurting. They know that that's true, but then this other thing answers that question of why. Why did it happen to me? Why does one person get the same virus and have seriously adverse effects, and the other person, it's like nothing happened? why does one person get it and one person doesn't when they seem to be doing the same things? And so if you remember back to the example of the granary and the idea of the termites would eat out the bottom of the sticks, the supports in the granary, and it would fall. And the anthropologist was like, well, the termites ate it out. That's why it fell. And they're like, no, but why was that guy sitting under the granary when it fell? That's the witchcraft part. That's the sort of larger reason. And I think that if you think about it, this is something that people, we've been told to follow the science, right? We're always following the science. We're going to follow the science. And I'm not saying we shouldn't follow the science, but sometimes the science can be a little bit sterile in terms of giving us these answers to these questions. Well, why do we see the things that we see? Why does it seem to be different among different populations? Like I said, why do people that are sitting next to each other and do the same things have very different courses or different reactions to things? And that's where these kinds of larger beliefs come in. There's a section in there which deals with a form of belief in our own society and other societies about sort of charismatic Christianity and ideas about the self and how one is exposed to God and prayer. And so there's a lot of interesting things that people believe about their bodies and about their connection to the supernatural in other societies as well as among our own. So I think this is one of the reasons I think that talking about how people understand sickness and health is one of those kind of fascinating things. The other thing that I think is a reason that medical anthropology has been popular lately is that it brings together some of the stuff that we had back in the biological anthropology section with some of the cultural anthropology section. So like I said, Professor Anderson teaches medical anthropology, but she's a biological anthropologist. And so she brings in that side of things together with the culture. My wife is a cultural anthropologist, and so she brings together some of the biological, but it's more from a cultural anthropological perspective. So at a time when, in some ways, and you probably don't care about this, but the discipline of anthropology feels like it's splitting up sometimes between these two perspectives, this is a way to sort of bring them back together. And they give us a couple examples, which both John and Dylan were kind of interested in. The lactose tolerance, the idea of why and how people become lactose tolerant. So who wants it, John or Dylan? Your last chance, John. You're a senior. You may as well take it. What did you get out of that?
It's just that it's like a scientist, like there was like research showed that it was like in the 60s that like not much people were digesting like fresh milk, and then the later
generations became more lactose tolerant. So this is something that, on the one hand, it can be a deep cultural practice on people that have come from populations where they tend to have dairy, but it also can change relatively quickly sometimes in human populations. So it's a super interesting thing because obviously, dairy is a cultural thing. It depends on what area of the world you're from, but it has implications for your biology. There's another example they use here is malaria resistance via getting the sickle cell trait. We talked about this a long time ago. You probably don't remember, but it's an adaptive trait, and I've put adaptive in quotes there because sickle cell is, if you get it wrong, if you get 2 recessive sickle cells, it's deadly. You're unlikely to live to adulthood. So it's adaptive in its heterozygous state. But it's a really kind of cruel way to adapt to an environment. And the environment is that of irrigated agriculture and mosquitoes. And so sickle cell tends to arise in those regions where there's irrigation and mosquitoes. It's, again, adaptive, but in that way that evolution is not always nice to us in terms of how it works selectively. You don't want this. It's very maladaptive in other environments. And certainly when people from those regions go into other areas and then are having offspring with sickle cell trait, not adaptive at all. Both of these things, the way that we have observed them in the United States, we have sometimes assigned these things to racial categories. But in both of these cases, we see that they are actually geographically, and so people of all different skin colors, including very dark Africans who were dairy, who did dairying, have lactose tolerance, up to the sort of very light-skinned Europeans. And then same thing with sickle cell trait. Although a lot of it is in West Africa, there are definitely parts of India as well as even Greece that have a certain a higher prevalence of sickle cell trait. So this is another reason I think that medical anthropology has been kind of cool these days, because it brings together the cultural and the biological and sort of puts them into dialogue with each other. The other thing that that anthropologists have done is to examine the world of what we call biomedicine, the world of shots and pills and the research world that we know. And one thing that anthropologists have said is that, yes, obviously biomedicine and biomedical advances are hugely important, but to the extent that it will work also depends somewhat on your culture and your belief and your values. And so they've done some really interesting studies with different placebos. You can look up some of these on YouTube. They're pretty interesting. How if you tell somebody that this is really going to help you, sometimes that belief can make it work for you. They've done some interesting study with placebos, for example, and various forms of depression. And if it's given by a person in a white coat, sometimes that has a higher effect. And so this is something that when you're reading that Body Ritual Among the Nakirema article is something that you might keep in mind as well, is that there's a whole ritual dispensing to our medications, and it helps. It helps us to believe that what we're taking is working for us, and it doesn't help us if we don't believe it. The other thing that anthropologists have explored is not just kind of the biomedicine side, or what we might call the Western side, but what we call ethnomedicine, or what Levin and Schultz term ethnomedical systems. And so again, this has been something, because people are looking for different alternatives maybe to biomedicine and to the practice of biomedicine, a lot of people have turned to ideas that we have called folk medicine. And in some ways, we're not necessarily saying they're true, but there might be some interesting things that go on in different ethnomedicines as well, and it's worth paying attention to. And in fact, many of the drugs and stuff that we have were once used as herbs and plants in ethnomedicine, and then are kind of made more potent in labs. And so there's an interplay between the ethnomedical and the biomedical. And I'd also like to introduce here the idea that most people around the world practice something that we have come to call medical pluralism. That is to say, they might use some folk medicine, some beliefs, some cures from their own traditions, but they also might turn to the biomedical system at different points. In our own society, people might go to the hospital, but they also have their church all praying for them, and very much believing that their health is going to be determined by divine intervention. So there are all kinds of ways in which there's not necessarily there are very few people, I would say, who are like, I totally am just complete cut and dry science person, or I don't believe any of that. Most people kind of mix it up a little bit. And so there's not, I wouldn't say, a lot of people try to oppose or draw a line between what we call ethnomedicine and biomedicine. But in practice, a lot of times these things are connected. So people will go to a ritual specialist And the ritual specialist will say, yeah, well, you should do this thing plus take some of these antibiotics that I got. So it's a very important, I think, as people who know about medical anthropology and public health, to kind of use the system that is there to think about how it is possible to intervene. So, not sure if this is something that made medical anthropology hot or not, but a number of you were interested in these passages, and they've been very they've been very important to think through. And the idea of this, the idea of structural violence comes to us from the anthropologist and medical doctor Paul Farmer, who is pretty famous for founding Partners in Health and his work, especially in Haiti, but also in different parts of the world. And his idea was, and drawing on other people as well, is that your economic situation and your political situation is also part of your health situation. And that what he meant by structural violence is that some people live in places and societies, and in all societies, where you're going to have differential access to healthcare, differential access to medicines, differential access to good food, good water, clean water, and that all of these things can become a form of violence, not in the sense that somebody's going up and shooting you, but that you become more susceptible to diseases because of the conditions, the economic and political conditions in which you're in. And so that is a form of violence, especially against people who are in a situation of inequality with regard to their own society or in the world. And so this has been a really interesting idea to think through. It's a difficult idea. And Farmer's work has been for example, with tuberculosis, and especially also with HIV/AIDS in Haiti. And the ideas that he said is that, in some ways, the biggest risk factors were actually poverty and inequality, not necessarily, or I mean, obviously there's a virus there, but the way it is transmitted and who lives and dies from that are very much in some ways structured by the society and the economic and political position that people hold in it. We probably don't need a huge amount of reminders when we look around the world at kind of the differential rates of our current pandemic, and if we look at the people in our own society that have been the most affected by it, it is also a form, we might say, of this idea of structural violence. The other point about, at the end of this section, Levin and Schultz talk about the future of medical anthropology. And I started off by saying that, this is something that has been fairly hot recently, even before our current ideas. And obviously, the issues of health and aging and access to healthcare are not going away very soon. And so what we're trying to think about here is, well, I think it's become obvious that shots and pills, just having them doesn't necessarily make a society healthier. So understanding where people are coming from, understanding their access to these things is going to be important if we want to think about the health and solve some of these issues of access around the world and within our own society. And so whenever you look at cultural difference, whenever you think about, oh, well, these people, the Nakirema, seem so culturally different, always try to think about, well, are there disparities or inequalities within and between societies? Is the anthropologist telling us about these inequalities, or are they glossing it over as culture? Because sometimes we use culture, again, and going back to something we've talked about in the last class and in previous classes, we can use culture as a cutoff point. We just say, oh, well, that's their culture, they're weird. We should respect that they're weird, but they are weird. So, you know, no reason to keep asking. And I would just, again, prompt you to think, whenever there is a cultural explanation, that's the start of the conversation. That's the start of how we try to figure out what's going on. And we keep having to ask these questions, and we keep having to talk to people. We keep having to try and figure out what life is from their perspective. That may be a cultural explanation, but it can be quite different within our own society and within other societies as well. So again, this is the take-home message, I hope, from the last class as well as this one, is that being culturally sensitive is important, and we don't want to be culturally insensitive, but that's just the beginning. And we should realize that there are people in every society who actually might disagree with some of the things that are going on in their own society. There certainly are in our own country, and we probably need to pay attention to people who agree as well as who disagree. So that's a message for that. I wanted to show you something by Paul Farmer. It's about 10 years old, but I think it still holds up. It's from the NPR series, This I Believe. There it is. I believe in healthcare as a human right. So you get to see Paul Farmer a little bit in action and some of the things he's done. How do I, this is my final technology test. I'll stop sharing. What else do I want to do? I want to